I am going to call LB to introduce none other than. Now look at her. Look at her. I can't even be seen next to this. Oh, she's beautiful. Beautiful.
You're too sweet.
All right.
You're
LB.
too sweet. Hi. You know, our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. Who am I to be brilliant, fabulous, talented? Actually, who am I not to be? That's a little bit of a very famous speech. Does anybody know who is the originator of those words? Marianne Williamson, yes. And that is who is going to speak with us today. She has been speaking about reparations, talking about reparations, and fighting for reparations for decades. I had a little more to say today, but I'm going to cut it down too, Anita. But I would like for you all, because on top of being the author of 15 New York Times national bestsellers, okay, on top of that, she is one of the greatest historians that I have ever heard speak in my life. I didn't realize that. I've been reading and studying Marianne. She's one of my 3 sheroes I've had for over 30 years. Dr. Maya Angelou, Iyanla Vanzant, Marianne Williamson. I read a book by her called A Woman's Worth in college after I was divorced, a mother of 3 children, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old. I was beat down. I was beat down. I was an unwed teen mother in Detroit, grew up in dysfunction and poverty. I needed somebody to sow something of worth into me, and her book did that to me. It flipped my mind. She said, we're in a society where, as women, our youth is the measure of our usefulness, and our age is the measure of our uselessness. And she said that was not the case. And so reading that book was my intro into finding my inner worth. Never did I know that she was going to run for president of the United States and I would have the opportunity to even sit next to her, much less be in service to her presidential campaigns in 2020 and now in 2024. So it is my great honor to introduce to you Marianne Williamson.
What an honor it is to be here, and with truly some great women, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. LB, Anita, Janice, I see Michelle here, Dolores, some of you who I have known for quite a while, have learned with you, learned from you, Jackie, others, thank you. This city has meant a lot to me. I lived here for 8 years, raised my daughter here, and as I've mentioned a few times, one of the most important moments in my relationship with my daughter, I think, was when she told me, I think she was in her early 20s, and we were talking about Detroit, and I was expressing some ambivalence about some experiences I had had here. And she leaned over and she said to me, Mommy, I had a happy childhood there. And that just said so much to me, and that sort of says it all, and what the city has meant to me more than anything else. In 1998, I wrote a book called Healing the Soul of America. I published it in 1998, which is interesting because it's actually the year that I came here to pastor at the Church of Today, then called the Church of Today, that we then called Renaissance Unity. And when I started to read that book, when I started to write that book, my interest was in the intersection of spirituality and politics. So I hired a tutor for myself. I had, I'd gone to school. I knew probably what most people know about American history. I knew a lot of facts, but there wasn't any particularly strong connectivity. I didn't see any of the deeper patterns of American history particularly. But I hired a gentleman named Richard Bernstein, and I felt like I was just sitting at his feet. I felt that I was able to have all these personal lectures about American history. And when you do that, of course, you see patterns, you see dynamics. learning history is such a significant method of empowerment. We are so much clearer about what we owe our ancestors, what we owe our descendants. We are so much clearer about where we fit in to the arc of history, where we fit into the scheme of things when we understand our history. And when you do that, in terms of American history, of course, the history of slavery, the history of Black America, it's such a prominent piece of the American story. When I was writing that book, my interest, as I said before, was in this intersection of spirituality and politics that I, in some grandiosity, I think thought I was going to come up with. And of course, in doing so, I found out that this was a wheel that hardly needs to be reinvented. And I learned about the nonviolent philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. I learned that Martin Luther King had traveled to India to study the principles of nonviolence and to bring them back for application to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He said about Gandhi that he was the first person in human history to take the love ethic of Jesus. Now, remember, to Gandhi, Gandhi was not a Christian, so Gandhi would not have called it the love ethic of Jesus. He would have said the love ethic at the heart of all the great religious systems. Martin Luther King said he lifted that ethic of love beyond mere personal interaction and turned it into a broad-scale social force for good. So what you're talking about here is something so profound when Mahatma Gandhi said that love does not just apply to healing our personal relationships. Love can heal all social, political, and economic relationships as well. So in order to understand more, I began to understand more about American history. You can't really learn about American history without coming to understand more about the history of the Black Americans, history of slavery, the Civil War, the Reconstruction, the years of segregation, civil rights movement, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, Martin Luther King's assassination, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You just begin to see the larger patterns of everything that happened. And then when I was here, actually in Detroit, although it didn't start here, it started when I was living in Los Angeles. I wrote a book called Illuminata, and Illuminata came out before Healing the Soul of America. And what I would do with Illuminata is I would do these ritualized apologies. I had experienced once from this Catholic priest named Father Diorio, where Catholics were apologizing to non-Catholics. And then we used to do these things with men apologizing to women. And then I began to do these things with white people in America apologizing to Black people. And I would ask the Black people who were interested to please stand up, and white people would apologize for the history of slavery and all of that kind of thing. And I did it all over the country, and it was really very powerful. And then when we were here at Renaissance Unity, we used to do these racial healing circles. And then, of course, everybody in the culture was, talking about diversity trainings, and everybody was working through their issues and talking about they saw racism in their hearts and all that kind of thing. And I began to think in terms of, which is really what my work has always been, is how do you apply spiritual principle in a practical way to our lives? But what I wanted to talk about with Healing the Soul of America was, if a nation is just a group of individuals, then how do these principles apply to us collectively? And so there were a few things that came up for me. One is, you can't have the future you want if you don't clean up the past. It's really simple, actually. And that is as true of a nation as it is of an individual. But also, there's something about atonement and recognizing the mistake that you made, apologizing. But I began to realize when I saw all these people working through their racism and all of this stuff, I thought, well, wait a minute. If somebody owed me $1,000, I would appreciate it that they were working through their guilt, but what I really would want is my $1,000 back. And I began to feel that a lot of this was a substitute for the second part of the formula. And the second part of the formula is amends. It's not enough just to atone, it's also to make amends wherever and whenever possible. And that's when the conversation about reparations became true for me. It wasn't a larger philosophical thing. It is, as one of you, I think it was you, Janice, or Anita, I'm not sure, it's simply a debt that is owed. And I'm aware, you know, and this, I've said this many times, but I think it can't be said often enough, because I want people to hear it who might doubt this. In white audiences all over this country, you know, one of the things that I have come to believe very strongly, running for president now twice, is that the American people are good people. We are a decent people. We're not better than other people, obviously, but we're not worse. We have the same nobility and the same decency and the same intelligence, but somebody needs to call it out of us. And that's what's wrong with our politics today. They talk to the mean-spiritedness in people. They cultivate it as much as they react to it. They talk to the only me mentality. So I think that when, you know, my father used to say, he was a lawyer, and he used to say, speak to the smartest person on the jury. And I've always found in my career, you speak to the noble in people. There's a line in the Course in Miracles, people hear you at the level you speak to them from. And I've always noticed that and I remember I've had some of the most profound experiences with like young people, adjudicated kids, even young people in prison. I've worked with people in prison where I've said, we're going to talk now about like what we should as Americans be doing. And people are so grateful to be included in the conversation. And we get very, very serious, about what we need to do as a country. And I think that's what everybody craves, to be respected enough that somebody's acknowledging that your opinion matters. And when you speak to the noble in people, people are willing to rise to the occasion. So what I began to realize, I remember one situation, but I would notice this in Iowa and in New Hampshire. You know, these are some of the whitest states in America. And even in an all-white audience once in South Carolina. And I would be talking about my platform, my political platform, and then I get around to reparations. And I would notice the body language, this kind of bristling, like, we heard this about her, right? And then I would launch into kind of a 7th grade version, you know, just a 101A history lesson, 1619, and you know, this was before the 1619 Project. So, you know, a lot of people, really that far back? You know, 1619, the first slave ships, and you just sort of tell people the story in the early 1800s, the cotton industry, the cotton business starts revving up, so there's even more, talking about abolitionist movement, talking about the Civil War, talking about the 12 years of Reconstruction, talking about 100 years really from the end of the Civil War until the Civil Rights Movement, talking about Voting Rights Act, talking about Civil Rights Act, talking about, as I think, Janice, you mentioned, how at the end of the Civil War, there were between 4 and 5 million, historians estimate between 4 and 5 million formerly enslaved people, how they were promised by General Tecumseh Sherman 40 acres and a mule, how much difference this would have made in the lives of people. It's like, as Martin Luther King said later, we were freed. What were we freed to? If you tell people you're not enslaved any longer, but you don't have any way to feed your children, you know, that 40 acres and a mule meant everything. In the vast majority of cases, it was not given. Even where it was given, most of them it was taken away. The 12 years, how it would have been different if Lincoln lived. Johnson was a racist, you know, and then so that the Civil War was followed, what is essentially another 100 years of institutionalized suppression of black people and the black code laws. Meanwhile, a lot of people were either hearing some of this for the first time or hadn't thought about it since the 7th grade. You know what I'm saying? And it had never been explained in that much detail anyway. And then you talk about what the Voting Rights Act meant and what the Civil Rights Act meant, and Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson, and then how Richard Nixon won the election, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan worked for him and said, enough drama around race, let's have a policy of benign neglect, he called it. And then talking about, you know, if Johnson had been reelected, if Martin Luther King had lived, the Voting Rights Act was extremely important, the Civil Rights Act, desegregation was extremely important. However, I think they would have gotten to the next step, that final piece that I do believe that Martin Luther King certainly was thinking about, and that I think would have been part of that whole movement. had history gone in another direction. And that, of course, is that piece of financial compensation. And then I would talk about how, as Janice was talking about the Japanese, the surviving members of the internment camps, and how after World War II, the Germans had given $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations, because by the middle of the 20th century, it was recognized as a standard factor in the way the West looked at things, that if one people had transgressed against another people, that financial remuneration made sense. And I never understood, well, why wouldn't that apply to black people? Why would it be any different? It's almost like the situation is so big and was so long ago in some people's minds that they're not making the connection between the legacy and the financial circumstances today. All right, you might not believe me, but I'm telling you the truth. I finished that little 10-minute thing, and I had white people standing up. We've got to have reparations. We've got to do it. And I have seen it so many times that if you just give people the opportunity, oh, thank you, Anita. If you just give people, thank you, the opportunity, that they will rise to the occasion more often than you might think. I also understand the principles of nonviolence, at least intellectually, whether I'm always capable or choosing to, taking responsibility there in my own behavior, but I understand the concept. And Martin Luther King meant when he said, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. So I think, and you see this a lot on the left as much as you see it on the right these days, this smug self-righteousness, this assumption that you don't get it, this lack of patience with people. I was with a man at dinner about a year ago, actually, and he said something very interesting. There were some Trumpsters at the table, and I was getting very triggered by them. And my friend, who I normally thought of as a pretty reactive person, but I noticed how non-reactive he was at the table. He was way beyond me, actually, at that particular dinner. And I said, I asked him about it later, and he said something interesting. He said, when I'm in a situation like that, I just assume they're going to see, they just don't see it now. And that was really a lesson for me. And Martin Luther King's line about you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. And he would say, Martin Luther King, as part of the whole nonviolent political philosophy, would say that our main job is to see the innocence in someone. And you see the innocence in them, and then you can talk about almost anything. So that is where I got my interest in reparations. To me, it's a kind of no-brainer. Gandhi said that the problem with the world is that humanity is not in its right mind. America's not in its right mind today. America's not in its right mind. I was reading a quote the other day from Oscar Wilde. It said, if you're going to tell the real truth, some point or another, you're going to be found out. I think this really is a moment in our history to ask ourselves, are you going to play along or are you going to tell the truth? You're going to play along, you're going to tell the truth. And we've been told for so long, well, you have to play along. Because your best hope of getting anything is if you will just play along. And I think that this is a moment for us to have courage. I think it's a moment for us to be radical. The Declaration of Independence was radical. That's why Martin Luther King said, we're just here to cash a check. We're not here to ask for new rights. I think going back to the Declaration of Independence, once again, in terms not just in the history of slavery, this is history of the black Americans, but also just in the history of the United States on every level. It's very important to recognize the story that was born with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That declaration is our North Star. It's our mission statement. And when you have a personal mission statement, you know who you are and what you're here to do. And it says all men are created equal. All men are created equal. All given by their Creator inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And that governments are instituted to secure those rights, and that if the government's not doing its job, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. Well, that was a document of such profound social and political and moral enlightenment. And it was a burst of light in the history of humanity. The world would never be the same. And out of the 56 signers, 41 of them were slave owners. So that's America's story. That embodies the whole point here. America always has been and still is both and. It's not are we this or are we that, we're both and. We've always been both and. Every generation embodies and reiterates the struggle between two forces. Those who are willing to sacrifice and even die. Remember, all 56 of them, including the slave owners, were risking their lives signing that document because if the British had won the war, they would have been hanged as traitors. So we have always been and remain. Our generation is no different. Those of us whose hearts are in awe of the possibilities that derive from that principle of equality and the idea that everyone should be treated equal and everyone should have equal opportunity. But there have always been, from the beginning, this is all slavery was and has been with us in every generation since, including ours, powerful forces who for their own ideological and or financial purposes have no intention whatsoever of seeing that happen. And they have proven time and time again they'll go to any lengths necessary to make sure that it does not. Now, okay, that's where it began, but now let's look at the arc of American history. And if you look at the arc of American history, you don't just see the problem reiterated. You see problem solvers rise up in generation after generation. Some generations have to live this out much more dramatically than others. But if you look at our ancestors, it is dishonor to our ancestors to be cynical or to forget those who have triumphed over those forces. Our ancestors responded to slavery ultimately with abolition, with the Civil War. Our ancestors responded to the institutional suppression of women with the women's suffragist movement, the passage of the 19th Amendment. Our ancestors, many of them here in Detroit, responded to the Gilded Age with the establishment of organized labor. And our ancestors responded to segregation and the institutionalized suppression of black people with the civil rights movement. The reason I run for president twice is because it's our turn now. So to me, the issue is how do we in our time course correct this nation? And it is a moral correction. It is a spiritual and a philosophical as well as political and economic correction, no differently than every other system of social justice was. And I also want us to remember, standing here in a church, this is not the place not to have the conversation. This is the place where people have always had the conversation. Among white people, the early abolitionist movement began in the early evangelical churches of New Hampshire. Many of the women who were the leaders of the women's suffragist movement were religious Quakers. And Dr. King, of course, was a Baptist preacher. So the idea of social justice movements, you are always talking about forces that on a material plane are more powerful than you. And they have the money, they have the technology of the time, they have the government of the time, they have the business of the time. And those who truly stand for justice, whether they were the abolitionists or the suffragists or the labor organizers or civil rights, they didn't have any of those powers. They had powers greater, as Martin Luther King would say, greater than the power of bullets. We have faith. We have faith in those things as yet unseen. And this idea of bending the arc, that the moral arc of the universe is long, it bends towards justice. But who are we? We are to be the benders of the arc. You know, one of the things that I read a book about Lincoln last year. Not the best book I've read about Lincoln, but I certainly learned some things that I had not. It was called There Was Light. And one of the things that I realized reading that book that was very interesting, it was talking about the difference between the provocateur, the activist, and the politician. So the provocateur brings up the subject. And when the provocateur starts, it sounds so radical and outrageous to the status quo of their time. And sometimes the provocateurs, such as John Brown on the issue of slavery, of course, pay the terrible, terrible price. But the provocateur opens up the space. And in this, if you look at John Conyers, for instance, somebody had to open up the space, right? And then the activists run in. Then the activists can come in. And that's where we are with reparations. The very fact that you're having a Detroit Reparations Awareness Day, the very fact that COPRA exists, we're into the next phase of things. We're into the next phase of things where there's a conversation that had not happened before. I'm sure many of you, or some of you anyway, remember the Democratic debate in 2020, maybe it was in 2019 at that time, at the Fox Theater. When I felt Irma Henderson, I felt the women that I knew, the great matriarchs of Detroit. It was like I felt them, and I knew. It's something that came over me. If you do not mention this right now, you will regret it for the rest of your life. And even though I didn't know specifically who was in the audience, I knew where I was. And I knew there were people out there I didn't even know who they were going, you will mention it or not. I could just feel it. And let's not forget, it was Kamala Harris who took the conversation away from me. And I'll tell you something, if I was the woman then that I am now, I would have said, wait a minute, what just happened? What just happened? But I didn't quite have that nerve right then. So we have gotten to the point where the conversation, and of course where politics comes in, the politician is often not a person who was early in the conversation. Look at even slavery. Lincoln was not early in the conversation. He was not even an activist. He tried hard for the compromise. He took it to the point where, no, it must be now. However, in that book, I read something so fascinating. It was a quote from Lincoln that one of his friends reported. You know, if you read about that history of time, you know, the Amazing Grace phenomenon, it wasn't just one man who wrote that song. It was a kind of phenomenon at the time where people didn't see and then they saw, because they saw something after which you couldn't unsee it. A lot of times it was people who passed, white people who passed slave trades, right, a trading block. A lot of times it was someone who visited the South and saw something that they'd heard about but they'd never seen before, including chain gangs and so forth. And a line from Lincoln early in his career that I find this such an amazing line because it's so startlingly modern sounding. He was standing and he saw a slave trade and he said to his friend, if I ever have a chance to hit it, I'm going to hit it hard. Isn't that fascinating? It's so modern sounding to me. He was the politician. It's often the politicians who take it. Oh, someone like Lyndon Johnson. I mean, it was the work of the civil rights movement, but then it's often that politician who can then bring things home, which I find fascinating. So that's where we are now with reparations. So we're at the age of the activists. What happened for me when I was running for president, last time I talked about reparations, so as long as I talked about it, then the other candidates had to answer the question from the press, and then when I was no longer in the race, they didn't have to anymore, which is the value of the race. The value of a presidential race is the conversation is there. And that's why you support that candidate. You are supporting the fact that this conversation is there, because right now we have a political system, and that includes our current president, who no one in this room can tell me, what is he saying he's going to do in the next 4 years other than finish the job? He's saying that to people who have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to put food on the table. They get away with talking as little as possible about things that matter. And that's why Martin Luther King said your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter. Politics is where we should be talking about things that matter. Politics is not an area that should be dominated by the ultimately meaningless preoccupations of the current establishment. And yet that's where we are. Gandhi said politics should be sacred. It means it should be the deepest place where we talk about the deepest things. So we are at the age of the activists. Now we need, I believe, and one of the things that I have felt in running for president, is we need a politician now. You know, the whole thing of H.R. 40, Janice, tell me if I'm wrong. I think if John were here, he would say, correct me if I'm wrong, enough with H.R. 40, we know what happened. This idea that they're going to investigate what happened. I think we're now at a point where we're very clear what happened. And we don't need another study. When you have a study, when you have a presidential commission, that's where ideas go to die. And then the commission is published and they put it on the shelf. Right? So it was very important for opening the conversation, very important as the loom onto which to weave the activism. What we need now is a president who says to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who says to Sandy Darity, who says to people such as yourself, we're going to go to Camp David for a weekend, and we're going to deliver to the American people on Monday an outline for a plan, and we're going to do it in our time. That's what has to happen now. And so what we're doing now is important. Just keep the conversation alive, because that's how the system works. They will work to numb you. They will work to make it, it's just like what you're doing. It's like, John, I'm going to keep it alive, right? And that's so important in our time, because, and when you think about, certainly the abolitionists were told, don't even try. The women's suffragists were told, don't even try. The labor organizers, don't even try. Civil rights workers, don't even try. Let's not be the first generation of Americans to wimp out on doing whatever it takes to course correct this nation when it has swerved as far away as it has now, and has swerved at so many times in our history from the better angels of our nature. They started it. Our ancestors started this. When we're talking about reparations, we're not talking, in my mind, we're not talking about starting something new. We're talking about continuing and bringing to the ultimate completion, a process which our ancestors began. When Germany paid reparations to Jewish organizations, it didn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen. But I have always felt that it went far towards not only financial remuneration, but a level of emotional and psychological healing between Germany and the Jews of Europe. Germany did such full-on mea culpa. There wasn't any of this, well, it wasn't really me, it wasn't my parents, none of that. It was such a full-on mea culpa. That war was over in 1945, and you have synagogues in Munich. Not that global anti-Semitism isn't a problem, again, it certainly is, but it's not based on that phenomenon the way it would have been. We're reacting to something that theoretically ended in 1865, and we are still passing the baton, a very toxic baton, generation to generation, parents handing it to their children. It's time for us to do something fundamental. It's time for us to do something great. That's what's wrong with America today. Americans are hardwired to do great things. You tell us to do small things and it makes us tired. Tell us to do great things and we're ready to go. Reparations is a great thing. Other generations have done great things. I think it is a great thing that is a part of an entire matrix, because this matrix of an economic paradigm by which corporate profits come before people, before animals, and before planet is just a reiteration of the same sin. And that is the primacy of property rights being placed before the primacy of life. That's all that slavery was. That's all that's happening when carcinogens in your food are in your food that shouldn't be there. That's all that's happening when 68,000 people in America today die of health care every year because they don't have it. It's all that's happening in every sector of our society in which people's lives are falling apart. Sometimes people even losing their lives because of the sick malevolence by which we think that something lifeless matters more than life, and we think that anything at all matters before love. We must stand for love, we must stand for mercy, and we must stand for justice. And I believe that more people in America do love than hate. But those who hate, hate with conviction. And if you have 10 people with conviction who hate, and you have 100 people with love, but the people who hate are the ones who love, even though it's only 10 of them, their will carry the day. We must love with as much conviction as is displayed today by those who hate. And that means we must have courage. We don't need any more data. We don't need, we really, it's even like with this business of like, we're going to study. No, we know what happened. We've analyzed on both a spiritual and political level. Oh, we know what happened and we know what's happening. Now it's time not to summon more information. It's time to summon some courage to say what we really want and in our time to make it happen. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. All right, somebody give me a time check. What time is it? Okay, 6:23. This is not going to be long. But we, in Cobra, we end with Harambe, which is not the name of an ape. It's Swahili for let's all pull together. But this was such a beautiful moment, and you know we got the great picture of the shrine giving birth to a president. All right, y'all, because we have to be ride or die about our allies. We got to be sort of NATO about this, that you pick on her, you pick on us. We have to be that way, because you do know when people put their life or their money on their line, when they put their mouth or their presence on the line. She showed up for reparations. Now we need to show up for her. All right, do I hear an amen or a clap? We need to have as much conviction over our reparations as some people have over apologizing for the people who won't pay us. Oh, we got to do the lesser of two evils. Oh, wait another 400 and whatever years. I don't know. I don't have 400 years. Maybe you do. I'm not eternal like that. But we need to do this now. And we can. That's why you're here, but you are the ones chosen to take this message out for Tuesday. So on Tuesday, we can make our voices heard. It's like, can you hear me now? If we can make Biden lose, then he can hear us before Super Tuesday. And what we want him to hear is reparations now. We can make somebody have leverage to negotiate that. So let's make it happen, Detroit. Make it happen, Detroit, because when you do it here, they'll hear it on Super Tuesday when 1/3 of this country has a presidential primary on March 5th. So Detroit is actually going to make the world believe. Detroit will make you believe. Can you